At the very heart of Beijing, enclosed by walls so vast they seem to bend the horizon, stands a city within a city. A universe built not for living but for ruling. The Forbidden City does not announce itself with warmth or invitation. It dominates. Its scale overwhelms the human body, its symmetry disciplines the eye, and its silence carries the weight of centuries. To step inside is to enter a space designed to erase individuality, where every stone, every gate, every measured distance exists to remind those within that power here was not shared, not negotiated, and never questioned. This was not merely a palace. It was a mechanism of control, a physical manifestation of cosmic order, as the Chinese emperors understood it. And for more than 500 years, it was the most tightly guarded center of authority on Earth. The story of the Forbidden City begins not with beauty, but with fear. In the early 15th century, the Ming dynasty ruled China, but its hold on power was fragile, shaped by recent rebellion and internal distrust. The Yongle emperor, born Zhu Dai, had seized the throne through civil war, overthrowing his own nephew. He ruled as a victor, but also as a man haunted by legitimacy. To secure his reign, Yongle believed power must be centralized, ritualized, and placed beyond the reach of ordinary human intrusion. Beijing, closer to the northern frontiers and easier to defend, would become the new imperial capital. At its center, an unprecedented complex would rise, one that fused architecture, cosmology, and absolute authority into a single enclosed world. Construction began in 1406 and would consume the labor of more than 1 million workers. Trees were felled from distant forests, stones were dragged across frozen rivers in winter, bricks were fired in kilns hundreds of kilometers away. Every material was selected not only for durability, but for symbolic meaning. Yellow glazed roof tiles, reserved exclusively for the emperor, proclaimed supremacy under heaven. Vermilion walls represented authority and protection. The north-south axis aligned the palace with the cosmic order, placing the emperor at the center of the universe itself. This was architecture as ideology, built to communicate a single, unchanging message. The emperor was not merely a ruler of men, but the son of heaven, the bridge between the divine and the earthly realm. Yet while the Forbidden City was designed to project eternal stability, its foundations were soaked in human cost. The laborers who built it lived and died in anonymity, their names erased, their bodies buried beneath the very stones they laid. Accidents were frequent, exhaustion relentless, punishment severe. The palace that would become a symbol of imperial splendor was, from its earliest days, already a grave for countless invisible lives. Power here was not only displayed, it was extracted. Once completed, the Forbidden City became a world governed by rules more rigid than law. Access was restricted not only physically but socially, linguistically, even emotionally. The outer court was reserved for ceremony and governance, a stage where the emperor appeared distant and untouchable. The inner court, sealed deeper within, was a labyrinth of residences, concubine quarters, servant corridors, and hidden passages. This was where life unfolded, but never freely. Every movement was recorded, every interaction regulated, every gesture bound by ritual. Privacy did not exist. Surveillance was constant. Silence was enforced. At the center of this world lived the emperor, a figure elevated above all others, yet paradoxically imprisoned by his own divinity. From childhood, emperors were raised within these walls, educated to believe they carried the fate of the empire within their bodies. They ate alone, slept guarded, and trusted almost no one. Their marriages were political, their friendships suspect, their emotions dangerous. The palace that existed to protect them from threats beyond its walls often became the source of their deepest isolation. Surrounding the emperor was a population whose lives were defined by service and submission. Thousands of eunuchs lived within the Forbidden City, men castrated in youth to eliminate any threat to imperial bloodlines. Officially, eunuchs were servants, but in reality, they became intermediaries between the emperor and the world. They controlled access, carried messages, managed resources, and over time, many accumulated immense informal power. Yet this power was fragile. Eunuchs could rise quickly, but they could fall even faster, often executed, imprisoned, or erased from history when political winds shifted. Their loyalty was absolute because their survival depended on it. Alongside them lived the imperial women empresses, consorts, concubines, maids. Their lives were governed by rank systems so complex that a single misstep could result in disgrace or death. Selection into the harem was not a privilege freely chosen, but a fate imposed. Young girls were taken from across the empire, trained to obey, to remain silent, to exist only as reflections of imperial desire. Jealousy was institutionalized, rivalry inevitable. Poison, false accusations, and quiet disappearances were not anomalies but tools within a system that rewarded proximity to power while offering no protection from it. The Forbidden City thus functioned as a machine that consumed human lives to maintain the illusion of eternal order. Emperors came and went, dynasties rose and fell, but the palace remained, absorbing each generation's ambition, fear, and suffering into its walls. Fires would destroy entire halls. Intrigues would collapse reigns overnight. Yet the structure endured, repaired and restored, always reaffirming the same truth: individuals were temporary, but power was meant to appear timeless. By the time the Ming dynasty fell in the 17th century, betrayed from within and overrun from without, the Forbidden City did not collapse. It was simply inherited. The Qing dynasty, foreign rulers from the Manchu people, took possession of the palace and adapted it to their own rule. They changed rituals, modified spaces, and imposed new hierarchies, but the core logic remained unchanged. The palace continued to isolate its ruler, regulate its inhabitants, and silence its victims. What survives today as a museum, visited by millions, was once a sealed universe where history was not observed, but lived and endured. Behind every gilded roof and carved dragon lies a story not recorded in official chronicles. The servant who vanished without explanation, the concubine who never left her courtyard, the emperor who ruled the world, but could not escape his own palace. The Forbidden City was never only a symbol of glory, it was a place where power demanded sacrifice, and where countless lives were buried, not beneath the earth, but beneath silence. Beyond the grand ceremonial halls of the outer court, past gates that narrowed both space and privilege, lay the inner court of the Forbidden City, a realm never intended for public eyes, where imperial power did not perform but persisted, day after day, in a suffocating atmosphere of ritual, suspicion, and controlled intimacy. If the outer court was the face of empire, the inner court was its nervous system, transmitting fear, desire, and obedience through corridors designed to conceal as much as they revealed. Here, power did not announce itself with proclamations. It whispered, observed, waited, and punished. The inner court was built as a domestic space, yet it was anything but private. Emperors lived here with their empresses, consorts, concubines, children, eunuchs, and servants, forming a population that at times exceeded 10,000 individuals, all enclosed within walls that none could leave without permission. Every building followed strict hierarchy. The Palace of Heavenly Purity, once the emperor's primary residence during the Ming dynasty, symbolized male authority and cosmic balance, while the Palace of Earthly Tranquility represented the feminine principle and ritual continuity. These names suggested harmony, but daily life inside them was defined by tension and surveillance. From the Qing dynasty onward, emperors often slept not in the grand symbolic halls but in smaller, more defensible chambers deeper within the complex, a tacit admission that even absolute rulers feared those closest to them. Assassination, poisoning, and rebellion were not distant threats. They were intimate possibilities. Emperors ate meals prepared under extreme scrutiny, with tasting rituals designed to detect poison. Yet history records that many still died young, their bodies weakened by stress, isolation, and the crushing psychological burden of divine kingship. The women of the inner court existed within one of the most rigidly stratified social systems ever created. The empress stood at the apex, followed by consorts and concubines arranged into ranks with precisely defined privileges, clothing allowances, and access to the emperor. Advancement was theoretically possible, but in practice rare and dangerous. Favor could elevate a woman overnight. Loss of favor could condemn her to decades of isolation within a single courtyard. The Forbidden City contained beauty of exquisite refinement: embroidered silks, painted screens, carved jade, but these luxuries functioned as gilded restraints rather than freedoms. Jealousy was not merely emotional, it was structural. The system ensured competition, because competition preserved imperial control. Women informed on one another, alliances formed and collapsed, and false accusations could lead to demotion, confinement, or death. Official records rarely mention these punishments in detail, yet scattered memorials and court documents reveal patterns of disappearances that cannot be explained by illness alone. In this world, silence was survival, and memory itself was dangerous. Children born within the inner court were raised not by affection but by protocol. Imperial princes were separated from their mothers, early entrusted to tutors and officials who trained them to suppress emotion and embody ritual. Brothers became rivals by design, each potential heir watched closely, each mistake magnified. The Forbidden City raised emperors not as sons, but as instruments of continuity. The cost of this system became tragically visible during times of succession crisis, when paranoia consumed the court and blood ties offered no protection. If the imperial women represented controlled proximity to power, eunuchs represented controlled access to it. Castrated to eliminate sexual threat, eunuchs were allowed into spaces forbidden to all other men. They dressed the emperor, carried his messages, guarded his secrets, and observed moments no official ever witnessed. Over time, this proximity translated into influence. Some eunuchs rose to astonishing levels of authority, managing finances, commanding armies, and shaping policy from behind screens. Yet their power rested entirely on imperial favor. When dynasties shifted or emperors died, eunuchs were often purged en masse, scapegoated for corruption that had been structurally inevitable. One of the most enduring paradoxes of the Forbidden City is that it was designed to ensure absolute control, yet it repeatedly produced instability from within. The more tightly life was regulated, the more it encouraged intrigue. The more sacred the emperor became, the more isolated and manipulable he grew. The palace protected rulers from the outside world, while slowly severing their understanding of it. Ministers who spoke uncomfortable truths were kept at a distance. Eunuchs filtered information. Ritual replaced reality. By the late Qing dynasty, this internal decay had become impossible to ignore. Emperors such as the Guangxu Emperor attempted reform, only to find themselves imprisoned within their own palace by conservative forces led by Empress Dowager Cixi, herself a product of the inner court system. Her rise from concubine to de facto ruler demonstrated both the extraordinary agency possible within the palace and the immense cost required to achieve it. Cixi mastered the rules of the inner court not to dismantle them, but to survive and dominate within them. As foreign powers encroached on China and modernity pressed against the palace walls, the Forbidden City remained stubbornly resistant to change. Electricity arrived late. Railways stopped at a distance. The imperial court clung to ritual, even as the world beyond transformed at terrifying speed. The palace that had once symbolized cosmic order now appeared increasingly anachronistic, disconnected, and brittle. When the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1912, the Forbidden City did not immediately empty. The last emperor, Puyi, remained inside for years, a child ruler without a throne, performing rituals for a dynasty that no longer existed. His presence turned the palace into a mausoleum of authority, preserved but powerless. When he was finally expelled, the Forbidden City ceased to be a living court and became what it is today, a historical artifact, curated and observed. Yet the transformation into a museum did not erase the lives embedded in its walls. The floors worn smooth by generations of servants, the sealed courtyards where women waited for summons that never came, the hidden corridors used for discreet removals all remain as silent witnesses. The Forbidden City survived because it adapted its function, but the system that created it collapsed under its own weight. What remains is not only architecture, but a warning. Power that isolates itself, that confuses ritual with legitimacy and control with stability, ultimately consumes those who wield it, and those trapped within its orbit. The Forbidden City endures not because it succeeded, but because it failed in a way so monumental that history could not look away. If the emperors of the Forbidden City were its symbolic heart, and the inner court its anxious mind, then the vast, unseen population of servants, maids, artisans, guards, and laborers formed its bloodstream flowing endlessly through corridors they could never claim as their own. These people left no monuments, no portraits, no official biographies. Yet without them, the Forbidden City could not function for a single day. Their lives were the price paid for imperial permanence, and their suffering was so normalized that history nearly forgot them altogether. From the earliest years of construction under the Yongle Emperor, in the early 15th century, the palace consumed human labor at an astonishing scale. Hundreds of thousands of workers were conscripted to quarry stone, fell timber, fire bricks, carve marble, and transport materials across vast distances. Many never returned home. Accidents, exhaustion, disease, and punishment claimed lives quietly, recorded only in sparse bureaucratic tallies. The palace rose not only from earth and wood, but from bodies worn down by obedience. Once completed, the Forbidden City required an enormous permanent workforce. Servants rose before dawn and slept after midnight, their schedules dictated by bells, drums, and ritual timetables that left no room for personal will. A maid might spend decades polishing floors. She was forbidden to walk upon freely. A guard might stand watch at the same gate for a lifetime, never knowing the purpose of the processions he protected. To serve the emperor was considered an honor, yet it was an honor stripped of agency. For palace maids, life followed a path of quiet erasure. Recruited as children from across the empire, often from poor families who viewed palace service as economic salvation, they entered a world from which few ever truly escaped. Rules governed their speech, posture, and even facial expression. Romance was forbidden. Marriage was impossible. Aging brought not freedom, but invisibility. Many elderly maids died within the palace walls, buried without ceremony, their names unrecorded. Some, upon eventual release, found themselves unable to adapt to life beyond ritual, having been shaped entirely by submission. Eunuchs occupied a similarly tragic position, though their suffering was more visibly extreme. Castration, performed outside palace walls under brutal conditions, was both a physical mutilation and a social transformation. Eunuchs were legally classified as neither fully male nor fully human in the Confucian moral hierarchy. They were despised and feared, yet relied upon. The palace created them, empowered them, and destroyed them in cycles that repeated across dynasties. A eunuch could rise to extraordinary influence, but his fall was almost always fatal. What united these lives was silence. The Forbidden City functioned because silence was enforced at every level. To speak out of turn, to repeat what one had seen, to acknowledge what was unofficial, all were punishable offenses. Walls were thick, courtyards vast, and yet privacy was an illusion. Surveillance was constant, not only by officials but by peers incentivized to report each other. Loyalty was measured not by virtue, but by discretion. Even death was controlled. When an emperor died, entire sections of palace life were suspended. Servants were confined. Movements were restricted. Rumors were crushed before they could form. In some periods, concubines without sons were expected to commit suicide or face lifelong confinement, their existence deemed unnecessary once their reproductive role ended. These practices were justified through ritual language, yet their cruelty was undeniable. The palace did not simply rule lives. It decided when lives no longer mattered. As centuries passed, the Forbidden City accumulated not just artifacts, but unresolved grief. The halls that tourists admire today were once spaces of anxiety, anticipation, and despair. The polished stones absorbed footsteps of people who walked them knowing they would never leave. The symmetry that appears so serene was maintained through relentless discipline, enforced by punishments rarely acknowledged in official histories. By the 19th century, as China confronted internal rebellion and foreign invasion, the palace's human machinery began to fail. Corruption flourished not because individuals were uniquely immoral, but because survival demanded it. Underpaid servants stole. Eunuchs sold access. Officials accepted bribes. The system blamed individuals for behaviors it had structurally guaranteed. When crises erupted, the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, foreign occupations, the Forbidden City responded not with reform, but with withdrawal, tightening rituals as the world collapsed beyond its gates. The abdication of the last emperor did not immediately liberate those still inside. Servants continued their routines long after imperial power had vanished, performing rituals for ghosts of authority. When the palace was finally cleared and converted into a museum, many former servants remained nearby, unable to detach from the only life they had known. Their testimonies, recorded decades later, speak not of nostalgia, but of numbness, a sense that their lives had passed without ever fully belonging to them. The Forbidden City today presents itself as a masterpiece of civilization, and in many ways, it is. Its architecture is unmatched, its symbolism profound. But beneath that grandeur lies a human ledger written in absence. History remembers emperors, empresses, and dynasties because power leaves records. It forgets servants because suffering does not announce itself. Yet it is precisely these forgotten lives that reveal the true cost of absolute power. An empire can command obedience, but it cannot erase humanity without consequence. The Forbidden City endured for centuries, but it did so by consuming the people within it, hollowing itself from the inside out. When it finally fell, it was not conquered by armies alone, but by the exhaustion of a system that demanded too much silence for too long. The palace still stands. The voices do not. To understand the Forbidden City only through emperors and ministers is to misunderstand how power truly functioned within its walls. Behind the visible hierarchy of officials and rituals existed another system, quieter but no less decisive, shaped by women whose lives were confined to the inner court, yet whose influence could alter the fate of the empire. These women empresses, consorts, concubines, and imperial mothers lived at the center of power, while remaining legally invisible, their authority real but never formally acknowledged. The Forbidden City did not merely house them, it absorbed them, transforming intimacy into politics and family into statecraft. The inner court was designed as a separate universe, physically sealed off from the outer court, where male officials governed. This separation was ideological as much as architectural. Confucian doctrine insisted that women should remain distant from governance, yet imperial reality contradicted this ideal at every turn. The emperor's private life was inseparable from the continuity of the dynasty. Producing heirs was not a personal matter, it was the foundation of political stability. As a result, women became central to the survival of the state, even as their voices were suppressed. From adolescence, selected girls were brought into the palace through elaborate recruitment rituals. Chosen for beauty, lineage, and perceived virtue, they were removed from their families and stripped of former identities. Once inside, their lives were governed by rigid ranking systems that dictated where they lived, how they dressed, and even how they were allowed to feel. Advancement depended not on merit or intelligence, but on proximity to the emperor's favor, a currency as volatile as it was dangerous. One night of attention could elevate a woman's status. Years of neglect could erase her existence. The empress occupied the highest formal position among palace women, yet her authority was often the most fragile. Officially, she was the moral center of the inner court, responsible for discipline, ritual propriety, and harmony among consorts. Unofficially, she was constantly threatened by rivals seeking to replace her. Empresses who failed to produce sons were particularly vulnerable. In a system where lineage defined legitimacy, infertility was not a private tragedy but a political liability. Many empresses lived under constant surveillance, aware that one misstep could result in deposition, confinement, or worse. Concubines existed in an even more precarious state. Their value was narrowly defined by fertility and obedience. Pregnancy elevated them, childbirth determined their survival. Mothers of imperial sons gained leverage, protection, and sometimes influence over succession. Those without children were expendable. Historical records, sparse and euphemistic, hint at forced suicides, sudden illnesses, and unexplained disappearances that followed shifts in favor. The palace was a place where women could die without having officially lived. Yet within this oppressive structure, some women learned to navigate power with extraordinary precision. Empress dowagers, in particular, occupied a unique position. As mothers of emperors, especially child emperors, they could rule in practice while remaining symbolically subordinate. Their authority was justified as maternal duty rather than ambition, allowing them to issue commands, influence appointments, and shape policy while maintaining ideological cover. In these moments, the Forbidden City revealed one of its deepest contradictions. Power was condemned in women, yet relied upon them in moments of crisis. The most famous example, Empress Dowager Cixi, emerged from the lowest ranks of concubinage to become the most powerful figure in late Qing China. her rise was neither accidental nor purely personal. It was enabled by a system that forced women to compete in silence, rewarding those who mastered patience, alliances, and restraint. Cixie's decades of control over the empire demonstrated that the Forbidden City was never as male-dominated as official histories suggested. It was governed through a constant negotiation between visibility and concealment. Daily life for palace women oscillated between ritual and isolation. Days were structured by ceremonies that emphasized obedience and repetition. Nights were marked by fear of illness, loss of favor, denunciation, or abandonment. Friendships were risky. Trust was conditional. Even motherhood did not guarantee security, as sons could be removed and raised by others, severing emotional bonds in the name of propriety. Love, when it existed, was dangerous. As dynasties weakened, the inner court became a battleground of blame. Officials accused women of corruption and decadence, attributing political failures to moral decay within the palace. These accusations ignored the systemic constraints that had shaped women's actions for centuries. The Forbidden City used women as symbols of virtue, when convenient, of decay, when expedient, while denying them agency in the historical record. When imperial rule ended in the early 20th century, the women of the Forbidden City did not emerge as liberated figures. Many were dismissed without compensation, returning to a world that no longer recognized them. Others remained behind, maintaining rituals for emperors who no longer ruled. Their lives had been structured entirely around a system that vanished almost overnight, leaving them without identity or purpose beyond its walls. The Forbidden City is often remembered as a monument to masculine authority, yet its survival depended on women whose sacrifices were rendered invisible by design. Their stories complicate the myth of absolute power, revealing a palace sustained not only by command and obedience, but by emotional labor, reproductive control, and silent endurance. To walk through the inner court today is to pass through a space shaped by lives that history preferred not to see, but could never fully erase. If the women of the inner court embodied power without a name, then the eunuchs of the Forbidden City represented power without a face. Neither fully visible nor entirely hidden, they moved through every layer of palace life, bridging the outer court and the inner court, carrying messages, enforcing rules, and quietly shaping outcomes that official histories often attributed to emperors alone. The Forbidden City could not function without them, yet it also feared them deeply. This fear was not irrational. Across dynasties, eunuchs repeatedly proved that proximity to power could outweigh rank, education, or legitimacy. The origins of the eunuch system were rooted in control. Castration was meant to eliminate sexual threat and ensure loyalty, allowing these men access to imperial women and private chambers without challenging Confucian norms. In theory, eunuchs were servants with no lineage, no descendants, and no future beyond obedience. In reality, they became the most informed individuals within the palace. They heard what ministers could not, saw what officials were never meant to witness, and understood the rhythms of imperial life more intimately than any scholar official. From dawn until late night, eunuchs regulated the emperor's existence. They controlled access to his chambers, managed schedules, delivered memorials, and supervised rituals. A document could disappear, be delayed, or be subtly reframed before ever reaching the throne. A minister's fate might hinge not on his argument, but on whether a eunuch deemed him inconvenient. Over time, this logistical authority evolved into political leverage, particularly when emperors were young, indifferent, or isolated. The Ming dynasty demonstrated the full consequences of eunuch empowerment. As emperors withdrew from daily governance, eunuchs filled the vacuum. They established parallel intelligence networks, supervised tax collection, commanded military forces, and conducted interrogations. Figures such as Wei Zhongxian transformed the Forbidden City into a stage of terror, where loyalty was measured by ritual devotion rather than competence. Officials who resisted were purged, imprisoned, or executed, often on fabricated charges delivered through eunuch-controlled channels. The Qing dynasty, wary of Ming excesses, attempted to restrict eunuch authority through strict numerical limits and regulations. Yet structure could not eliminate dependence. Emperors still relied on eunuchs for privacy, security, and continuity. In moments of succession crisis or imperial withdrawal, Eunuchs once again became indispensable intermediaries. Even under tighter control, their influence persisted in subtler forms, shaping court etiquette, managing imperial finances, and aligning themselves with powerful women of the inner court. Eunuchs lived in a state of permanent contradiction. They were omnipresent yet socially erased, feared yet despised, powerful yet profoundly vulnerable. Their bodies marked them as outsiders, their status revocable at any moment. Many were recruited from impoverished families, sold or offered in desperation. Once inside the palace, survival required intelligence, adaptability, and emotional restraint. Loyalty was transactional, not moral. Betrayal was often preemptive rather than malicious. Daily life for eunuchs was governed by exhaustion and vigilance. They slept in communal quarters, rose before dawn, and remained on constant alert for shifts in favor. Illness, aging, or a single accusation could result in expulsion or execution. There was no retirement in the modern sense. Those who accumulated wealth often hid it, knowing that visibility invited suspicion. Fear shaped their psychology as deeply as ambition. The presence of eunuchs also reshaped the emotional landscape of the Forbidden City. They became surrogate confidants for emperors isolated by ritual and rank. In the absence of genuine friendship, eunuchs provided continuity, familiarity, and emotional labor. This intimacy blurred boundaries, allowing manipulation to flourish alongside dependency. The palace was not merely a political institution, it was an emotional ecosystem sustained by imbalance. As dynasties declined, eunuchs once again became convenient scapegoats. Official histories blamed them for corruption, decadence, and collapse, deflecting responsibility from structural failures and imperial decisions. While abuses were real, the narrative of eunuchs as singular villains obscured a deeper truth. The Forbidden City created conditions where informal power thrived precisely because formal systems were rigid and performative. When the imperial system finally ended, eunuchs faced an abrupt erasure. Many were expelled without compensation, returning to a society that rejected them. Some remained within the palace, performing rituals for a vanished empire, caretakers of silence rather than authority. Their lives, like those of the women they served alongside, dissolved into anonymity once the structure that defined them collapsed. Today, the halls of the Forbidden City appear serene, stripped of tension and fear, yet every corridor once echoed with footsteps that were never meant to be remembered. Eunuchs were not anomalies within the imperial system, they were its consequence. The Forbidden City demanded control without trust, loyalty without belonging, and service without humanity. In fulfilling those demands, eunuchs became both victims and architects of a system that ultimately consumed itself. To understand the Forbidden City is to recognize that power rarely resides where it is declared. It accumulates in silence, proximity, and endurance. The eunuchs understood this better than anyone, and paid the price for that understanding with their bodies, their names, and their place in history. By the 19th century, the Forbidden City still stood intact in stone and timber, but the system that had animated it for nearly 500 years was slowly hollowing out from within. Rituals continued with flawless precision, court ranks were observed, bells rang at prescribed hours, and memorials still flowed through the gates, but the confidence that once justified absolute rule had fractured. The palace no longer felt like the center of the world, it felt like a stage repeating a script whose audience had already begun to leave. The king-emperors of this era inherited a structure designed for stability, not adaptation. The Forbidden City was built to preserve cosmic order, not to negotiate with a rapidly changing global reality. As Western powers forced open China's ports through war and unequal treaties, the imperial court retreated further into ceremonial insulation. Decisions affecting millions were debated within halls that deliberately excluded urgency, dissent, and innovation. The deeper the crisis outside the walls, the more tightly tradition was clutched inside them. Emperors such as Daoguang and Xianfeng confronted pressures no predecessor had faced: industrialized warfare, global trade imbalances, internal rebellions on a massive scale. Yet within the Forbidden City, the response was often delay, deflection, or ritual appeasement. Memorials warning of danger were softened in language to avoid offense. Officials competed not to solve problems, but to survive politically. The palace rewarded caution, not clarity. The Taiping Rebellion marked a psychological rupture. For the first time in centuries, a movement claiming moral and cosmic legitimacy rivaled the Qing mandate on a national scale. Millions died, entire regions collapsed, and the court's authority visibly faltered. Inside the Forbidden City, fear manifested not as reform, but as increased suspicion. Eunuchs were monitored more closely, officials purged more frequently, and access to the throne narrowed even further. The system responded to existential threat by tightening inward, accelerating its own paralysis. No figure embodied the contradictions of this era more than Empress Dowager Cixi. Rising from concubinage to become the most powerful individual in China, she ruled from behind the screen, mastering the language of tradition while bending it to personal survival. Within the Forbidden City, her authority was absolute, yet perpetually contested. She preserved the palace's rituals even as she manipulated succession, delayed reforms, and redirected resources toward maintaining control rather than restructuring governance. Under Cixi, the palace became both more powerful and more fragile. Reformist officials were alternately encouraged and crushed. Modernization efforts advanced in fragments, never allowed to threaten the symbolic supremacy of the throne. The Forbidden City became a paradox, a seat of immense authority that could no longer command genuine loyalty beyond its walls. Its power was still feared, but no longer believed. The Boxer Uprising exposed this reality with brutal clarity. As foreign armies marched on Beijing, the Forbidden City, once imagined as inviolable, was abandoned by its rulers. The court fled, leaving behind a palace that could not protect itself. When foreign troops entered the capital, the symbolic heart of the empire lay exposed, not conquered by force alone, but by irrelevance. The cosmic order the palace claimed to embody had failed its ultimate test. The final years of the Qing dynasty unfolded within a structure already emptied of meaning. The child Emperor Puyi ascended the throne amid rituals older than memory, yet governed nothing. Decisions were made by regents, ministers, and foreign advisors, while the Forbidden City functioned as a ceremonial shell. The throne remained, but sovereignty had dissolved. In 1912, the abdication ended more than a dynasty, it ended a worldview. The Forbidden City did not fall, it was simply left behind by history. Its gates remained closed, its halls silent, inhabited briefly by a former emperor reduced to a private citizen within his own palace. The rituals ceased, the hierarchy vanished, and the intricate machinery of imperial life stopped without drama, like a clock whose spring had finally unwound. Yet the palace endured. Stone does not require belief to stand. In the decades that followed, the Forbidden City was redefined not as a seat of divine authority, but as a museum. Tourists replaced courtiers. Guidebooks replaced edicts, and silence replaced fear. What had once been inaccessible became exposed, its secrets flattened into displays and captions. But survival does not equal vindication. The Forbidden City remains as evidence of both human ambition and human limitation. It demonstrates how power, when insulated from accountability and adaptability, becomes self-consuming. Every corridor testifies not only to grandeur, but to the lives constrained, erased, and sacrificed to maintain an illusion of permanence. The palace outlived its gods, its emperors, and its cosmic mandate. What remains is a question rather than an answer: whether any system built entirely around control can truly endure the world beyond its walls. The Forbidden City endures today, not because the system that created it succeeded, but because stone, wood, and memory are more resilient than ideology. Visitors walk its vast courtyards under open skies, surrounded by symmetry and color, often unaware that they are moving through a landscape designed not for beauty alone, but for obedience. Every axis, every elevation, every gate was meant to teach one lesson above all others: power must appear eternal, distant, and unquestionable. For nearly 5 centuries, the Forbidden City succeeded in this mission. It shaped behavior, belief, and fear with extraordinary precision. Emperors rose and fell within its walls, but the structure itself remained unchanged, reinforcing the illusion that authority did not belong to individuals, but to a cosmic order older than time. Yet history ultimately revealed the cost of this illusion. When power refuses to listen, it also refuses to learn. And when it cannot learn, it cannot survive change. The tragedy of the Forbidden City is not that it was cruel. Many systems of its era were, but that it was inflexible. It was built to preserve harmony by eliminating uncertainty, but uncertainty is the engine of adaptation. The palace silenced dissent so thoroughly that by the time danger could no longer be ignored, no language remained to confront it. Officials learned to speak in ritualized phrases, emperors learned to rule through distance, and generations learned that survival depended on concealment rather than truth. Those buried within this system were not only the servants, concubines, eunuchs, and officials whose lives vanished without record, but also the emperors themselves. Absolute power did not free them, it isolated them. Raised to believe they were divine intermediaries, they were denied normal human relationships, unfiltered information, and emotional autonomy. The throne promised immortality but delivered confinement. Even at the height of its glory, the Forbidden City was a place of profound loneliness. When the palace finally lost its authority, it did not collapse in fire or revolution. It simply became irrelevant. This may be its most enduring lesson. Power does not always fall dramatically. Sometimes it fades quietly, sustained only by ceremony until the world moves on without it. The abdication of the last emperor was not the end of violence or suffering in China, but it marked the end of a system that could no longer justify itself. Today, the Forbidden City is preserved as heritage, admired for its scale, craftsmanship, and symbolism. But preservation should not mean reverence without reflection. To admire the palace without understanding its human cost is to repeat its original mistake, valuing permanence over people. The true legacy of the Forbidden City lies not in its roofs or halls, but in what it teaches about governance authority and the fragility of systems that mistake control for stability. Across history, many regimes have built their own versions of forbidden spaces, institutions designed to separate rulers from reality, to replace accountability with ritual, and to silence discomfort in the name of order. The Forbidden City stands as a warning that such designs may endure physically, but they hollow out morally. No wall is thick enough to keep change out forever. In the end, the palace that once claimed to represent heaven on earth became a mirror of human limits. It reminds us that power without empathy erodes itself, that tradition without reform becomes ritualized denial, and that silence, no matter how carefully enforced, always accumulates a cost. The Forbidden City survives, but its gods are gone. What remains is history, open, visible, and finally accessible, and perhaps that is its final transformation from a symbol of absolute power into a space of collective memory, where the past can no longer command, only teach.